All right, we're diving deep today and going to try to really understand LLMs,
Yeah.
not just what they do, but how they actually work.
Yeah,
We're going to get into the nuts and bolts here.
exactly. It's like peeking under the hood of a really complex machine.
Okay.
We're going to be exploring some really fascinating concepts, like how these models learn from data,
Right.
the power of self-attention,
Oh,
and even the idea of LLMs as vast libraries of what we call vector programs.
vector programs.
Yeah,
Okay, you're already making my brain tingle a little bit.
it's a lot.
So where do we even begin with something this complex?
Well, at their core,
Yeah.
LLMs are essentially prediction machines.
Okay.
They learn by being trained on just enormous amounts of text data,
Right.
and they use this data to predict what word should come next in a sequence.
So it's like a supercharged version of like autocomplete, but instead of just suggesting the next word in a text message,
Exactly.
it can generate like whole paragraphs, translate languages, write different kinds of creative content,
Yeah.
even answer your questions in an informative way.
All of that.
Right.
Yeah, and it's that seemingly simple mechanism of predicting the next word is surprisingly powerful.
Yeah.
It forms the basis of even the most complex tasks these models can perform.
Wow.
This type of training is called autoregressive training,
Right.
and it's like the foundation upon which everything else is built.
Okay, so it's all about predicting the next word,
Right.
but how does it actually decide which word is most likely?
Right.
I mean, isn't language full of nuance and context?
Yeah.
I mean, there must be tons of possible words that could come next.
Absolutely.
So how does it choose?
That's where the concept of self-attention comes into play.
Yep.
It allows the model to weigh the importance of different words in the input.
Mm-hmm.
Just like when you're reading, certain words jump out at you as being more crucial to the meaning.
Yeah,
The
totally.
model's doing the same thing.
So it's not just blindly picking the most common word that follows, it's actually analyzing the whole input.
Exactly.
And figuring out which parts are most relevant.
That's it.
Wow.
And it does this through a two-step process.
Okay.
First, it performs what's called hard retrieval.
Hard retrieval.
Imagine you have this massive library of functions,
Okay.
each one designed for a specific task.
Uh-huh.
Hard retrieval is like using a specific key
Okay.
to locate the right function
In that vast library.
in that vast library, yeah.
Okay, so the program key in this case would be certain words or phrases in the input
Right.
that signal what kind of task the LLM needs to
Yeah,
perform.
exactly.
Okay,
Those key words help the model zero in on the most relevant parts of the input.
gotcha.
Then comes soft composition.
Soft composition.
It's like once the LLM has found the right function,
Mm-hmm.
using the program key, it then uses a weighted average of the most important input tokens
Okay.
to actually execute that function and produce the output.
So the weights determine how much emphasis is placed on each part of the input when making the prediction.
Right.
Yes, and the model learns these weights through its training. It's constantly adjusting and refining them to improve its predictions over time.
This is starting to make more sense,
Good.
but it's definitely a lot more complex than I initially thought.
It is, yeah.
It's not just simple word associations.
Bro.
There's like a whole system of analysis and weighting happening behind the scenes.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
But I think the analogy of LLMs as vast databases of these vector programs
Okay.
can be really helpful for understanding how it all works.
Okay, let's unpack that analogy a little bit.
Sure.
What exactly are vector programs in this context?
So think of it this way. Every word and concept is represented by the LLM as a vector,
Okay.
which you can imagine as a point in a multidimensional space.
Oh, wow.
The relationships between these words are then encoded in the way these points are positioned relative to each other
Okay.
within that space.
So it's not like traditional lines of code,
Right.
but more like a map
Yes,
of word relationships where the meaning is embedded in the connections between the words.
that's a great way to visualize it.
Okay.
And these vector programs, they represent different tasks or operations
Uh-huh.
that the LLM can perform.
Right.
For instance, there might be a vector program for writing a Shakespearean sonnet,
Right.
another for summarizing a factual topic,
Okay.
and another for translating between languages.
So when you give the LMM a prompt,
Yeah,
it's like you're searching through this database of vector programs.
that's the idea.
And the words you use in the prompt act as a kind of search query.
Exactly. The LLM analyzes the prompt,
Yeah.
identifies the keywords that act as our program key,
Right.
and then tries to activate the most relevant program based on those words.
That's fascinating to think that something as simple as a text prompt can trigger such complex processes.
It is, yeah.
It's almost like we're unlocking different parts of the LLM's brain
Yeah.
by using the right words.
And just like with any search engine, the way you phrase your prompt, the
Right.
specific words you use, and even the order in which you present them can all influence which program gets activated and ultimately what kind of output you get.
So there's like a real art to crafting the perfect prompt.
There is.
It's like learning how to speak the LLM's language almost.
Exactly.
Wow.
And that's something we can delve into a bit later.
Okay.
But first, let's talk about where all the information that makes up these vector programs comes from.
Okay.
Because that's another key part of understanding how these models work.
Right.
And it also reveals some potential limitations.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. I'm ready to dive deeper into this whole information side of things.
All right, let's do it.
Tell me more. Well, LLMs learn from massive data sets of text and code
Okay.
scraped from all over the internet,
Wow.
from books, articles, websites, you name it.
So it's like they're absorbing a snapshot of human language and knowledge,
Yeah, it's like they're building up this internal representation.
of how humans use language and express ideas.
Right.
And then they use that representation to generate their own outputs.
Precisely.
And this is where things get really interesting, because
Uh-huh.
this is how LLMs are able to generate outputs that are not simply copied from their training data,
Okay.
but are actually novel creations based on the patterns they've learned.
Wait, so they can actually create something new, not just regurgitate what they've been fed.
It's all about the way they store this information.
Okay.
They create what are called embeddings,
Embedding.
which are basically vectors that represent the meaning of words and concepts.
Okay.
And these embeddings are organized in a continuous vector space,
Right.
which allows the model to interpolate between different data points.
Interpolate. What does that mean in this context?
It means they can essentially connect the dots between different pieces of information.
Oh, wow.
They can draw inferences and make connections that weren't explicitly stated in their training data.
So it's like they're able to fill in the gaps and come up with new ideas based on the patterns they've observed.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, that is really interesting.
It is.
But if they can draw inferences and fill in gaps, doesn't that mean they can also potentially get things wrong?
You're exactly right.
I mean, they're not actually understanding the information in the same way a human does, right?
That's an excellent point.
Okay.
And you've hit upon one of the key limitations of LLMs.
Got it.
They are incredibly powerful tools, but they are still just tools. They rely on statistical patterns and probabilities.
Uh-huh.
And while they can simulate human-like creativity and language generation, they don't possess true understanding or consciousness.
Okay, so there's a lot more to uncover here, especially when it comes to these limitations.
Definitely.
But I'm definitely starting to grasp how these things actually work.
Good.
This whole under-the-hood view is fascinating.
It is, and it's complex.
Yeah.
But it's really crucial to understanding how to use these models effectively. It's that.
Well, I'm definitely hooked now.
Good.
Tell me more.
All right.
Let's keep exploring this world of LLMs and all its intricacies.
Let's do it.
What's next on our deep dive agenda?
Ooh. Well, you mentioned limitations,
Uh-huh.
and it's important we dig into those a bit deeper.
Okay.
One of the biggest things to remember is that LLMs,
Yeah,
they don't actually understand information
right.
the way humans do.
Love.
They're amazing at recognizing patterns,
Right.
but they lack real-world experience.
Okay.
And the kind of common sense reasoning we often take for granted.
So even though their outputs can sound incredibly human-like, it's more like a really sophisticated mimicry,
That's a good way to put it.
like a parrot that can string together complex sentences
Mhm.
without really grasping the meaning behind them.
That's a good analogy.
Right.
And it's important to keep that in mind because it highlights why LLMs can sometimes produce outputs that are factually incorrect or just plain nonsense. They might be able to generate text that sounds grammatically perfect and even persuasive,
Right.
but the underlying logic might be flawed.
So it's like they can sometimes fool us with their fluency,
Yeah.
making us think they understand more than they actually do.
Exactly. And that's why critical thinking is so crucial
Right.
when you're interacting with LLM-generated content.
Okay.
You can't just take it at face value.
Right.
You have to evaluate the information, cross-reference it,
Yeah.
and be aware of the potential for errors or biases.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
You mentioned biases,
I did.
and I'm curious about that.
Yep.
Earlier, we were talking about how LLMs learn from these massive data sets of text and code.
Right.
Does that mean they can inherit biases from the data they're trained on?
That's a significant concern.
Okay.
If the training data contains biased or discriminatory language,
Right.
the LLM might unintentionally perpetuate those biases in its outputs. For example, if the training data overwhelmingly associates certain professions with a particular gender,
Uh-huh.
the LLM might generate text that reinforces those stereotypes.
So even if the LLM itself is just a neutral algorithm,
Yeah.
it can still end up producing biased outputs simply because of the data it's been exposed to.
That's right.
Wow.
And that's why it's so important to be mindful of the data that's used to train these models.
Okay.
Researchers are working on techniques to mitigate these biases,
Yeah.
but it's an ongoing challenge.
It's like the old saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
If you feed the LLM bad beta, you're likely to get bad results,
Right,
even if the model itself is perfectly designed.
precisely.
Okay.
And it's not just about overt biases either.
Okay.
It's also about the fact that LLMs are very sensitive to the frequency of information
Right.
in their training data.
Okay.
They tend to be better at tasks that are common and well represented in the data,
Uh-huh.
and less proficient at tasks that are rare or more nuanced.
So if the training data contains mostly examples of one particular writing style or viewpoint,
Yeah.
the LLM might be less capable of generating alternative styles or perspectives.
That's right.
Okay.
It's like a musician who's only ever listened to one genre of music.
Right.
They might struggle to play something completely different.
So it's almost like the LLM can get stuck in a kind of echo chamber
Yeah.
where it reinforces the dominant patterns it's been exposed to,
Uh-huh.
even if those patterns are not necessarily representative of the full range of human thought or experience.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And it's something to keep in mind when you're considering the potential impact of these models on society.
Right.
They can be incredibly powerful tools for communication and creativity,
Right.
but they also have the potential to amplify existing biases or limit the diversity of voices and perspectives.
That's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, it's a big one.
So given all these limitations, how can we make sure we're using LLMs effectively and responsibly? You mentioned earlier that there is an art to crafting prompts.
Right.
Can you expand on that a bit?
Absolutely.
Right.
Prompt engineering
Yeah.
is becoming a crucial skill
Okay.
for anyone who wants to get the most out of these models.
That too.
It's about understanding how they work,
Right.
their strengths and limitations,
Right.
and then using that knowledge to guide them towards the desired output.
So it's not just about asking a question or giving a command.
Right.
It's about carefully crafting the input in a way that elicits the best possible response from the LLM.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about framing your request in a way that aligns with the model's capabilities
Mm-hmm.
and minimizes the risk of errors or
Right.
unwanted biases.
Can you give me an example of what this prompt engineering might look like in practice?
Sure.
Okay.
Let's say you're using an LLM to write a short story.
Okay.
Instead of simply prompting it with, write a short story,
Right.
you might give it some specific details to work with. For example, you could say, write a short story about a young musician who discovers a magical instrument in an antique shop.
Okay.
This gives the model a more concrete starting point
Right.
and helps to guide its creative process.
So it's about providing enough context and direction to steer the LLM towards the outcome you're looking for.
Yeah,
Without being so prescriptive that you stifle its creativity.
exactly.
Okay.
It's a bit like giving an artist a blank canvas versus giving them a canvas with a rough sketch already in place. You're
Right.
providing a framework,
Uh-huh.
but you're still allowing room for their own interpretation and style.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
But it sounds like prompt engineering could be quite complex.
it can be.
Are there any specific techniques or strategies that people are using to get better results from these models?
There are a few techniques that have emerged as being particularly effective.
Okay.
One is called few-shot prompting,
Few-shot prompting.
where you provide the LLM with a few examples of the kind of output you're looking for. It's like showing them a template to follow.
So if I wanted the LLM to write a poem in a specific style,
Right.
I might show it a few examples of poems in that style before giving it my own prompt.
Exactly.
Okay.
This helps the model understand the patterns and conventions of that style,
Right.
which can lead to more accurate and consistent results.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah, it's a cool technique.
Are there any other techniques you can share?
Another technique that's gaining popularity is called chain of thought prompting.
Chain of thought prompting.
This involves guiding the LLM to break down a complex task into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of just asking it for the final answer,
Right.
You're encouraging it to think through the problem step by step,
Yeah,
almost like you're having a conversation with it.
exactly.
Wow.
This can be especially helpful for tasks that require logical reasoning or problem solving.
Right.
By making the LLM articulate its thought process,
Right.
you can identify any potential flaws in its logic and get a better understanding of how it arrived at its conclusion.
These techniques sound really interesting.
They are, yeah.
It's amazing how much control we can exert over these models simply by being more thoughtful about the way we communicate with them.
It is remarkable,
Yeah.
and it highlights the importance of understanding not just how these models work,
Right.
but also how to effectively interact with them.
Okay.
Prompt engineering is becoming an essential skill
Yeah.
for anyone who wants to harness the power of LLMs,
Right.
whether it's for creative writing, problem solving,
Hmm.
or simply getting more accurate and informative responses.
This whole conversation about LLMs has been a real eye-opener.
Good. I'm blessed.
It's like we've just scratched the surface of what these models are capable of
Yeah.
and what their potential impact on society might be.
We have. We
Yeah.
have just begun to explore this fascinating field.
Right.
And as LLMs continue to evolve and become more powerful,
Right.
understanding their inner workings and the intricacies of prompt engineering will become even more crucial.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far.
Good. I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Is there anything else you think is essential for our listeners to understand about how these models work?
Oh.
Any final pieces of the puzzle before we start looking towards the future of LLMs?
Yeah. I think one of the things that's really blown my mind during this deep dive is the sheer scale of information these LLMs are processing. We've talked about massive data sets and vector spaces and these intricate networks of word relationships. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around the complexity of it all.
It is mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to think this is still a relatively young field,
Right?
the pace of innovation in AI is incredible,
Yeah.
and LLMs are already having a significant impact on how we interact with information and technology.
It really feels like we're on the cusp of something truly revolutionary.
Yeah, it does.
But with any powerful technology, there's always a sense of both excitement and apprehension. Right.
What are some of the potential risks or challenges you see with the continued development and deployment of LLMs?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
As we've discussed, one of the biggest concerns is the potential for bias and misinformation.
Right.
If these models are trained on data that reflects existing societal biases, they could inadvertently perpetuate and even amplify those biases in their outputs.
And that could have real-world consequences, especially if people start relying on LLMs for things like making important decisions or forming opinions about complex issues.
Right.
We need to be very careful about the information we're feeding these models and how we're interpreting the information they give us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Critical thinking and media literacy are more important than ever in the age of LLM.
Correct.
We need to be aware of their limitations, question the information they present, and always consider multiple perspectives.
So it's not just about understanding the technology itself, it's about developing a more discerning and responsible approach to how we consume and interact with information in general.
Exactly. It's about becoming more informed and empowered users of technology rather than passive consumers.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
So as we look ahead to the future of LLMs, what are some of the most exciting developments you're seeing? Where do you think this technology is headed?
It's hard to predict the future with any certainty,
Yeah.
but there are a few areas that are particularly promising.
Okay.
One is the development of even more sophisticated and nuanced language models capable of understanding and generating even more complex forms of human communication.
So we could see LLMs that can not only write creatively, but also engage in meaningful conversations, understand humor and sarcasm, and even adapt their communication style to different audiences and contexts.
Exactly. We're
Wow.
already seeing progress in these areas, and I think we can expect even more breakthroughs in the years to come.
That's exciting.
Yeah, another exciting development is the integration of LLMs with other technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality.
That opens up some really interesting possibilities. Imagine being able to interact with virtual characters or environments that are powered by these sophisticated language models. It could revolutionize the way we learn, work, and entertain ourselves.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And beyond those specific applications, I think we'll see LLMs becoming increasingly integrated into the fabric of our digital lives. They'll be powering our search engines, our personal assistants, our creative tools, and so much more.
It's almost like they'll become the underlying intelligence that drives our interactions with the digital world.
That's a great way to put it. And it's both exciting and a little daunting to think about the potential impact of such a profound technological shift.
It definitely makes you wonder what kind of future we're creating and what role these powerful language models will play in shaping that future.
Right.
But one thing's for sure, it's going to be a fascinating journey.
I completely agree. And I think the most important thing for all of us is to stay informed, engage in these conversations, and think critically about the implications of this technology as it continues to evolve.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listener, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with this incredible technology.